Hello, my name is Dr. Larissa Allwork, and I'm a historian of the Holocaust and its legacies based at the University of Derby. I would like to extend my thanks to Catherine James and the Derby Holocaust Memorial Day Planning Group for inviting me to give this talk for Holocaust Memorial Day 2021 on this year's national theme, Be the Light in the Darkness. In 2020, I co-edited with Rachel Pistol, a historian based at King's College London, a collection of essays called The Jews, the Holocaust and the Public, the Legacies of David Cesarani. The process of compiling, editing, writing the chapters for this book was a deeply personal one for both of us. David Cesarani, an internationally renowned historian of Anglo-Jewish and Holocaust history, was our PhD supervisor and had passed away unexpectedly in October 2015. It was a great honour for us to bring together new pieces of research by his intellectual peers, such as the historian of the Third Reich, Richard J. Evans, and United States Holocaust Memorial Museum researcher, Jürgen Matthaus, as well as academic work by his doctoral students, Katarzyna Pershon, Shane Nagel, and Robert Sherwood. The collection also provided a space to reflect on David's extensive work as a public historian. He was involved in Nazi war crimes research in the 1980s and 1990s, and he was a historical advisor to the Imperial War Museum's first Holocaust exhibition, which opened in June 2000. He was also involved in Home Office discussions to establish a UK Holocaust Memorial Day, and he acted as a trustee for the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust between 2006 and 2013. In our collection, Olivia Marks-Waldman, who is Chief Executive of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, and Rachel Century, who is the Head of Outreach at the organisation, expressed the value that David brought as a publicly engaged historian to their work. He, and I quote Olivia and Rachel here, advised on themes for each HMD, the content of the ceremony. He became invaluable to the work of the Trust, ensuring that what we said and did was based on historical fact and accuracy. Moreover, in newspaper commentaries, journal articles, and book chapters published between the first UK Holocaust Memorial Day in January 2001 and David's untimely death in October 2015, he analysed and reflected on the scope and the purpose of the day, often against the backdrop of public debates and controversies. For David, the Holocaust was a singular historical event, the mass murder of around 6 million Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators during the Second World War. He was disappointed by failures to acknowledge the specificity of Nazi anti-Semitism, as well as feeling, and I quote here, uneasy about the appropriation of the Holocaust for political ends in contemporary and civic culture. However, there was also a strong universalistic streak to David's approach to the Holocaust, as long as this universalism was historically based, intellectually rigorous, and eschewed the easy generalizations. For example, he argued that good teaching about the Holocaust also directs his students to, and I quote here, to look at the other victims of racial policy and intolerance in the Third Reich, such as the mentally and physically disabled, Sinti and Roma, homosexuals, Black Germans, and certain church groups. He also believed that effective pedagogy about the Holocaust should include, I quote David again, the ways that racist and intolerant politicians seek power in democratic societies and then subvert the pluralism that they benefit from. He also believed that when understood as a genocide, discussions about the history of the Holocaust have the power to raise awareness of other forms of mass violence directed against national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups, past and present. His advice feels particularly pertinent against the backdrop of the ongoing prominence of the nativist rhetoric used by radical right-wing politicians in countries such as America, Poland, and Hungary, as well as during news reports that have documented the alleged systematic persecution and oppression of the Uyghur Muslims in China. In this short lecture for for Holocaust Memorial Day 2021, I will honour David's contribution to Holocaust Memorial Day by telling you about a local history of how Derbyshire's Jewish community responded to news of the Holocaust during and immediately after the Second World War. So, the Derby Hebrew congregation, the Second World War and the Holocaust then. The Derby Hebrew congregation was a diverse and thriving religious and community organisation during and immediately after the Second World War. Founded in 1889, the congregation's numbers increased during the Second World War, owing to evacuees from British cities to Derbyshire, refugees from Nazi-occupied countries, and from January 1942 onwards, the presence at the congregation of American Jewish servicemen from units based at Edgington, Weston-on-Trent and Sudbury. Some of the members of the congregation also had familial connections to continental Europe. One of the contributing dynamics to the founding of the Derby Hebrew congregation in 1889 was the rapid growth of the Anglo-Jewish community following the influx of Jewish refugees after the assassination of Tsar Alexander in 1881 and the anti-Semitic pogroms that erupted in its wake. These pogroms were particularly prevalent in what is now known as modern-day Poland and Ukraine. Indeed, Harris Levy, the president of the Derby Hebrew congregation from 1921 to 1958, was a refugee from Imperial Russia. The Derby Hebrew congregation raised money for a range of charitable causes during the Second World War. Historian of the congregation David Beeston has shown that the congregation supported wartime causes locally and nationally, including the Spitfire Fund, the Empire Distress Fund, the YMCA appeal, the Appeal for Dutch Relief, as well as forwarding donations to Derby Royal Infirmary Hospital. However, it is also significant that some of the congregation's activities were directed towards supporting the plight of the Jews in Europe. In 1942, the congregation contributed to the Polish Jewish Relief Appeal, and in 1944, it made donations to the United Appeal. Moreover, a Derby Hebrew congregation document from Derby Records Office gives us an insight into one of the key ways through which the congregation's leadership supported Jewish rescue efforts in Europe during the Second World War. A message to the congregation dated 19th May 1943 from its president, Harris Levy, its honorary treasurer, Dr. S.A. Miller, and Reverend Reuben Restan, announced that at a special general meeting of the Derby Hebrew congregation convened on 2nd May 1943, a decision had been made to establish, and I quote, a fund to assist in the holy work and paramount duty of saving Jewish life, particularly children, from the extermination campaign that is being carried out by the Nazis in Europe. All donated funds, the letter went on, could be paid alongside membership contributions to the Derby Hebrew congregation, which would be sent to support the work of an organisation called Youth Aliyah. This organisation was first established in Germany in 1932 and prepared Jewish teenagers to work on a kibbutz in Palestine. The appeal for congregation members to donate was made through language that stressed the vulnerability of children, the shared persecution of Jewish communities by the Nazis, the relative privilege of Anglo Jewry, as well as the continuing ambivalence of non-Jewish British citizens towards European Jewry's plight. The heightened emotionality of this appeal is evident in this extract from the document that was distributed to congregation members. So I'm going to read out a little bit of this document right now. Children can and are being saved from certain death, and only if we exert every effort to assist this work ourselves and make sacrifices to do so can we expect any help at all from the non-Jews. Fortune has saved us and our children from the terrible fate that has already overtaken millions of our fellow Jews, and each and every one of us will be answerable to his own conscience if he stands aside and fails to do the little that he can towards saving those who still survive and who can still be saved if only the material means be forthcoming. What perhaps makes this document most fascinating is that it opens up far more questions than it answers. As is often the case for any historical investigation, it is the gaps in the archives of the Derby Records Office that are as significant as the documents that have survived. For example, historians of the Third Reich know that by May 1943, the Third Reich's genocidal policy against the Jews was in full violence under the cover of war and occupation. By the end of 1942, approximately 4 million Jews had been murdered, mainly in mass shootings in the occupied Soviet Union, as well as through mass deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau and the death camps of Chelmno, Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor in Nazi-occupied Poland. Additionally, the date of the Derby Hebrew congregation's plea for contributions to Youth Aliyah also coincided with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 19th April 1943 to 16th May 1943. This was where Mordechai Anovich led the combined forces of the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union in armed resistance against German efforts to deport the remaining Jewish inhabitants of the ghetto. By 16th May, what has become one of the most iconic of uprisings had been ruthlessly suppressed, the ghetto area razed, and its inhabitants transported to concentration camps or extermination centres. What, of course, we don't know is how much the leaders of the Derby Hebrew congregation knew about these specific events, which were happening so far away. Neither do we know where the congregation derived their information from about the assault of the Jews in continental Europe. Certainly, in terms of Anglo-Jewry's response to the Holocaust, a number of reports and events issued to the public in 1942 had heightened the Anglo-Jewish community's awareness of the mass murders and everyday violence occurring in the Third Reich's occupation zones. For example, on 10th July 1942, the Jewish Chronicle reported on a BBC broadcast in Yiddish, which followed a European service announcement detailing accounts of Nazi violence against Jews in Poland. Also significant was the public response to the Regner telegram of 8th August 1942, in which Gerhard Regner, head of the Geneva office of the World Jewish Congress, sent an explosive message through American and British diplomatic channels to World Jewish Congress leaders in London and New York. The telegram reported that, and I quote, "In the Führer's headquarters, a plan has been discussed and is under consideration, according to which all Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany should, after concentration and deportation in the East, be at one blow exterminated in order to resolve once and for all the Jewish question in Europe." After initial skepticism by American diplomats, the telegram, thanks to Silverman, who was the diplomat in Britain, forwarded it on to Wise in America, who investigated its veracity before informing the American press about it in November 1942. In response to the news, Jews in many Allied countries marked 2nd December 1942 as an international day of mourning, while the social pressure generated by the publicity led to America, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the 9 Allied governments in exile to issue what was known as a Declaration on Atrocities on 17th December 1942. And this declaration collectively condemned the Nazi mass violence against the Jews. So certainly by spring 1943, Anglo-Jewry, represented at the national level by organisations such as the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Anglo-Jewish Association, were urging the British government to rescue as many European Jews as possible. However, British government strategy remained focused on the idea of liberation through victory in the war, while legal immigration to Britain and Palestine remained tightly controlled. This context helps historians to understand why, by May 1943, the Derby Hebrew congregation may have been moved to set up their fund. Whilst we do not know how much the congregation's leadership specifically knew about the events in Europe, we do know that by the end of 1942 and early 1943, there was much greater public awareness in Allied countries about the fate of the Jews. This public news may have been combined with verbal and written accounts of war destruction in Europe that may have been passed to the congregation by friends and family abroad, or by visitors to the congregation, such as the American servicemen at local Derbyshire army bases. Certainly within the Derby Local Studies archives, there is a document, an order of service for the National Day of Prayer and Dedication, issued on the third anniversary of the outbreak of hostilities. So the date of the document is 3rd of September 1942. And this particular document was issued by the London office of the Chief Rabbi. Tellingly, this order of service includes a memorial prayer for the victims of the mass massacres of the Jews in the Nazi-occupied lands. So we don't know how this order of service ended up in the Derby archives. It is one of a set of 3. The others relate to 1940 and 1941. However, its presence suggests that either a member or members of the congregation attended a ceremony in London, or the London office distributed these orders of service to encourage local congregations to hold their own ceremonies on these themes. Either way, this document from 1942 points to one of the possible ways in which the leadership of the Derby Hebrew congregation learnt about the fate of the Jews in Europe prior to the setting up of their fund in 1943. So the second question that is left unanswered then, but by the archive, of course, is why was Youth Aliyah chosen by the Derby Hebrew congregation as one of the main organisations that it supported in relief efforts for continental Jewry? This is difficult to ascertain as we have no documentary testimonials. We can begin though by having a firmer understanding of what Youth Aliyah was, as documented by historians of the movement Sarah Kadosh and Brian Amkraut. Originally founded in Germany in 1932, Youth Aliyah was incorporated into the Jewish Agency in autumn 1933, and its Jerusalem office was run by Henrietta Zolt, who had also established the US Zionist Women's Association, Hadassah. Zolt worked with her team to secure immigration certificates from the British government. These were then allocated to Jews between the ages of 15 and 17 living in the Third Reich, who were given agricultural placements in Palestine. Between 1934 and 1939, approximately 5,000 Jewish youths escaped the stultifying racial anti-Semitism of the Nuremberg laws and travelled from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Palestine. Viewed as encouraging Jewish emigration, the Nazis initially accommodated the work of Youth Aliyah, as shown by the historical research of Amkraut. However, by the late 1930s, the cumulative radicalization of Nazi anti-Semitism meant that the Youth Aliyah program found itself under increasing scrutiny and its leadership subject to increasing persecution. In December 1937, Eva Michaelis Stern, who was the director of the organization in Germany, was interrogated by the Nazi German authorities and was accused of producing propaganda against the Third Reich. Stern fled to Palestine initially before moving to London and setting up a Youth Aliyah office in the capital in September 1938. As Europe moved towards war, the focus of the London office became supporting refugee children in Western Europe and creating more publicity for the movement. By 1939, Youth Aliyah had received 15% of all British government validated immigration certificates for Palestine. The challenges that the organisation faced during the Second World War increased as time went on. And these challenges included getting immigration certificates from the British authorities, organising transport and funding travel. Additionally, Youth Aliyah European representatives faced and sometimes had to bend or break intransigent immigration rules to get Jewish youth off of the continent, whilst the Jerusalem office had to find placements for young people on agricultural settlements. Nonetheless, the organisation was successful in saving lives. It worked with approximately 10,000 people, or rather 10,000 children, across the Nazi-occupied Europe, and managed to rescue around 3,000 by bringing them to Palestine. So there are various reasons why the Derby Hebrew congregation may have sponsored Youth Aliyah in 1943. Certainly, some members of the congregation were politically active Zionists, as evidenced by the fact that the executive committee had agreed to the creation of a Zionist society on 28 September 1941. However, it is arguable that the rhetoric of children used in the Derby Hebrew congregation's funding appeal additionally shows the congregation's leadership were also very aware of the British government's immigration policy towards Palestine at this time, namely that it was highly restrictive, although there was some leniency for those legally categorised as children. For example, on February 3rd, 1943, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies had said in the House of Commons that the 29,000 Palestine immigration certificates for the period ending 31st March 1944 would be primarily allocated to Jewish children and a proportion of adults. Thus, the leaders of the Derby Hebrew congregation may have politically calculated that Youth Aliyah was a cause that was more likely to be supported by the British government because it primarily helped those classified as children, as well as having had an established reputation with the British immigration authorities built up through its work in the 1930s. Certainly, the cause inspired the loyalty of 27 members of the Derby Hebrew congregation who were still making annual donations to Youth Aliyah in 1956. After the war and the liberation of the concentration camps, the Derby Hebrew congregation continued to contribute to Jewish relief efforts in the displaced persons camps and orphanages of continental Europe. A piece of correspondence in the Derby Records Office dated 26 October 1946 from Derby Hebrew Congregation Honorary Treasurer Joseph Morris confirms the sending of a cheque for £56 and 2 shillings to the Central British Fund for Jewish Relief and Rehabilitation's Special Appeal for Continental Jewry. Morris also mentions that there is more money to be collected from Derby Hebrew congregation members for the Special Appeal for Continental Jewry. The Special Appeal was run by the Central British Fund for Jewish Relief and Rehabilitation, which had played a key role in the Kindertransport, which from December 1938 and throughout 1939 had brought approximately 10,000 Jewish children from the Third Reich to Britain. The type of post-war relief work undertaken by the Central British Fund included helping relief workers in Germany, Austria, Italy, Holland and Greece, assisting orphan Jewish children in Europe, as well as providing support to orphan children from the concentration camps who had been permitted entry to the UK for, and I quote from the letter here, mental and physical rehabilitation. Between 1947 and 1950, members of the Derby Hebrew congregation continued to make annual donations, contributing a total of £600 to the Central British Fund's relief efforts. I've explored this story in far more detail as part of the podcast series Global Derbyshire in 10 Objects, which was produced for the Being Human Festival in November 2020. So to conclude then, During the Second World War, the Derby Hebrew congregation became aware of the Nazi genocide of the Jews in Europe. It raised money to try and help Jewish youths to escape the camps and the killing fields. After the war, it raised money to try and help the relief and reconstruction effort in Europe. Through its charitable activities, the Derby Hebrew congregation tried to find some light in the darkness. Thank you.